Welcome back to Behind the Genius, where we uncover the hidden stories that history tried to bury. Today, we journey to the rolling hills of Kentucky. In the year 1898, an orphanage stood here, isolated, quiet, seemingly ordinary. But the Winthrop Home for Children was anything but ordinary. What made it so strange wasn't how it was built, or even who lived there, but what never happened inside its walls. No child was ever recorded as being born there. And just as mysteriously, no one was ever recorded as dying there. Not a single birth, not a single death, for decades. And yet, the children remained. Were they orphans of circumstance, or something else entirely? Tonight, we step inside the mystery of the Winthrop Orphanage, a place suspended between life and death, and one of the most unsettling, forgotten chapters in American history. Kentucky in the late 1800s was a land of both beauty and hardship. The rolling hills stretched out in waves of green and gold, their fields, stitched with tobacco crops and lined with weather-beaten fences. Coal towns pressed into the valleys, their chimneys smudging the skies with gray smoke. Life here was unforgiving, especially for the poor. Families grew large because children meant extra hands to work the land or the mines. But tragedy struck often. Disease could hollow out a household within weeks. Accidents in the mines claimed fathers. Mothers, overwhelmed and without resources, sometimes left their children in the care of strangers. And it was into this climate, in 1898, that the Winthrop Home for Children first appeared. On the edges of Ashford, Kentucky, a quiet town that has long since vanished from modern maps. The orphanage was not remarkable to look at. 3 stories of red brick, a slate roof pitched steeply against the weather, and tall, narrow windows that gave the impression of a building more watchful than welcoming. A wooden sign creaked at the gate, Winthrop Home for Children. For many families, the sight was a relief. To them, the building meant food, shelter, perhaps even education for the children they could not keep. But to the townsfolk of Ashford, Winthrop quickly became a place of whispers, because something about it felt wrong. Something about it defied the very nature of life. Official records describe the orphanage in neutral terms, its founding in the summer of 1898 by a benefactor from Lexington, its capacity for 30 children, its staff of 3 women, referred to as caretakers in the earliest documents. There is no mention of priests or medical personnel, though most homes of the time were affiliated with churches or hospitals. Yet within only a few years, visitors began to remark on the same uncanny detail. There were no births and no deaths ever recorded at Winthrop. In every other orphanage of the era, the paperwork was exhaustive. Birth certificates for abandoned infants, death certificates for the sickly, adoption documents for those who left. But in Winthrop's ledgers, these columns stood empty. Historians today still marvel at the silence in those pages. One of them, Dr. Harriet Cole, a professor of social history at the University of Kentucky, described the archives as a void in ink. She explained in an interview, "It is not merely that some records are missing or that a careless clerk failed to write them down. Entire categories of life are absent. No births, no deaths. And yet we know from census data that dozens of children were listed as residing there, decade after decade." The Winthrop home existed outside of the usual systems of accountability. The absence of records was one thing, but the absence of change was another. From the earliest eyewitness accounts, the children of Winthrop were described as unchanging, their appearances consistent, their ages seemingly arrested. A shopkeeper in town, Mrs. Evelyn Marks, kept a diary that survives to this day. In it, she wrote, in the winter of 1903, "I saw the children from the home again today at market. I know them as surely as I know the shape of my own hands, for they were there last year and the year before. The same number, the same faces, the same stature. They are not growing, they are not fading. I cannot say they are alive, though they walk. I cannot say they are dead, though they stare with such hollowness." Her words were not unique. Testimonies gathered from Ashford residents across the years repeat the same eerie details. The children were polite, quiet, and strangely still. They did not run in the streets or chase one another with the careless abandon expected of youth. Instead, they walked in pairs, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward, as if rehearsing some silent ritual. At times, townsfolk claimed, the children seemed to appear at once, as though they had been waiting just beyond sight. The building itself added to the unease. Visitors often described an oppressive silence within its walls, the kind of stillness that prickles against the skin. A delivery boy named Jonathan Reese, who lived into his 90s and gave an interview, near the end of his life, recalled accompanying his uncle on supply runs. "I remember walking in and it felt wrong the moment the door shut," Reese said. "The air was thick, but not with smell, just with weight. And then I saw them, the children, lined up in the yard like little soldiers. They didn't laugh, didn't fidget. They looked straight through me. I was a boy myself then, maybe 9 years old. And I'll tell you the truth, I never forgot their faces, because when I came back as a grown man, they were the same, not taller, not older, the same." If Reese had been the only witness, his memory might have been dismissed as exaggeration, but other accounts, from teachers, merchants, even traveling ministers, all describe the same phenomenon. In photographs that survive from the period, the images confirm the suspicions. Black and white portraits show rows of children with pale faces, their clothing formal, their expressions stiff. In one photo from 1905, a little girl in a dark dress stares directly at the camera. In another, dated 1918, the same girl appears in the same dress, her face unchanged. Scholars have studied these images for decades, debating whether they were staged, misdated, or fabricated. But the photographs were verified by multiple archivists, and their negatives remain intact. So what explanation remains? Some argue that the mystery is nothing more than poor record-keeping combined with local superstition, that the children were replaced over time by new arrivals, but their uniforms and haircuts gave the illusion of sameness. That frightened townsfolk exaggerated, their memories blending together. And yet, there is an undeniable weight to the pattern of silence. The Winthrop Orphanage existed for more than 40 years, and in all that time, no recorded death, no recorded birth, no official adoption left its paper trail. For an institution meant to house the most vulnerable, that absence feels like a shadow that only deepens with scrutiny. The town of Ashford whispered about it constantly. Parents warned their children not to wander near the orphanage. Farmers claimed to hear faint laughter carried across the fields at night, laughter that stopped the moment they tried to approach. The local priest, Father Alcott, preached sermons against the unnatural silence of Winthrop, declaring it a place outside God's grace. And yet the orphanage never closed. Supplies arrived, children remained, staff came and went, but life and death themselves seemed suspended. To step closer to the orphanage, one must also confront the nature of its caretakers. The 3 women who oversaw Winthrop were known only by their surnames, Sutter, Hale, and Davenport. Their origins are obscure. Some claimed they were nuns, though no church has ever claimed affiliation. Others said they were widows, bound together by grief. In photographs, they stand tall and severe, their dresses plain, their eyes unreadable. A merchant who delivered food once remarked that the women spoke in clipped phrases, never offering thanks, never haggling. They were efficient, but not warm. "It was as though they were not running a home, but a prison," he wrote. Visitors often noted that the women discouraged lingering. Deliveries were to be left at the gate or carried just inside the door. Outsiders were rarely allowed past the front hall. The few who entered deeper described long corridors lined with closed doors. The sound of faint footsteps echoing above, though no children were seen. One visitor reported seeing a classroom filled with desks, but the children sat motionless, hands folded, as if waiting for a teacher who never arrived. The strangeness extended even further into the supernatural, at least according to local lore. Stories spread of people walking past the orphanage at dusk and seeing faces in every window. Dozens of pale faces, all staring outward in silence. Others claimed that when they approached too closely, they felt suddenly disoriented, as though the building loomed larger than it should, stretching upwards into shadow. One farmer swore that his horse refused to pass the orphanage gates, rearing and snorting until he turned back. By 1910, the reputation of Winthrop had hardened. The town regarded it as cursed, but tolerated its presence. It was, after all, caring for children, or at least housing them. And so the paradox deepened, a place that gave shelter but defied life itself, a place where children lived, Yet neither grew older nor passed away. And still the photographs continued. Through the 1910s and 1920s, the same faces resurfaced again and again. The little girl in the dark dress, the boy with solemn eyes and a bow tie, the rows of children standing in perfect symmetry. Generations of townsfolk looked at these images and wondered, how could it be? Where did these children come from? Why did they never leave? For the next 40 years, the Winthrop Orphanage would remain a fixed point in Ashford, a place both feared and ignored. But its legend was only beginning to grow, because as the decades passed, the world outside changed. Wars came and went, machines modernized. Families moved westward. Yet within those walls, the children never seemed to follow. And when the orphanage finally closed in the 1940s, it left behind no records, no graves, no explanation, only the photographs, only the memories, only the silence. This is where the story begins, not with life, not with death, but with the haunting possibility of something caught in between. The Winthrop Home for Children was a place where history left no trace, but where time itself may have stopped. If this story sent a chill down your spine, there are more like it waiting for you. Don't forget to subscribe to Behind the Genius and turn on notifications so you never miss the hidden chapters of history that most would rather forget. Share this episode with someone who thinks they've heard every ghost story. Because the Winthrop Orphanage proves that sometimes the truth is far stranger than fiction. And if you'd like us to dive deeper into the mysteries of places lost to time, let us know in the comments. Until then, keep looking behind the walls, behind the myths, and as always, keep searching for the truth, behind the genius. The first children arrived at Winthrop in the autumn of 1898, just weeks after the building was completed. Records from surrounding counties mention several families surrendering, their offspring citing illness, poverty, or the death of parents. Yet the intake lists from Winthrop are curiously sparse. Only 10 names appear in the first year's ledger, names without dates of birth, without background notes, without the kind of detail one would expect. Just single entries, written in the same narrow hand: Sarah, Thomas, Lillian, Edward, Margaret, and so on. Beyond that, silence. In most orphanages of the time, children were noisy arrivals. Babies cried, toddlers clung to mothers. Older children carried the grief of leaving behind the only homes they'd known. But accounts of Winthrop's first residents suggest a different atmosphere altogether. Witnesses claimed the children who arrived did not cry. They did not protest. They did not resist the transfer of custody. Instead, they walked through the gates calmly, their small hands folded neatly before them, as if they had already rehearsed the act of belonging. One man, a farmer named Samuel Pierce, later testified to a county clerk that he delivered a wagon of food on the very day the first children arrived. He recalled seeing them lined up in the yard, waiting silently while the caretakers unlocked the door. They weren't talking to each other. They weren't fidgeting like children do. They just stood there, still as fence posts, eyes straight ahead. When the door opened, they marched in without a word. I thought to myself, Lord help them, they've already been broken. But the strangest thing is, they looked too clean, not travel-worn, not dusty, like they'd been standing there for hours before the wagon even came. It was the beginning of a pattern. For decades after, townsfolk would comment on how the children of Winthrop seemed to appear rather than arrive. Deliveries would find a new face among the rows. But no one could recall ever seeing that child brought in. Adoption never seemed to remove any either. The group was always the same, between 20 and 30 children, standing together in formation, rarely venturing beyond the orphanage walls. Inside, their routines were equally unsettling. Accounts from former staff, few and rare but invaluable, paint a portrait of eerie discipline. One caretaker, interviewed in the 1930s long after she left her position, described the children as obedient to the point of unnaturalness. She explained, "You never had to tell them twice. They lined up for meals before the bell. They ate in silence. They filed back to their rooms without complaint. If one was told to stop, they all stopped. It was like they were listening to something we couldn't hear. Some command passed between them." Reenactments based on her testimony are chilling to imagine. Rows of children in stiff uniforms, identical shoes clicking on the wooden floors, moving not in chaos, but in unison. They did not sing songs or play games, but sat in tidy circles, hands folded in laps, eyes fixed on the walls. When visitors asked what they were doing, the caretakers simply replied, "Waiting." It is important to understand how strange this was for the time. Orphanages, though often harsh, were noisy, bustling places. Children shouted, cried, fought, and formed their own small hierarchies. But Winthrop was different. Winthrop was quiet. Winthrop was still. Even the toys provided, simple wooden blocks, cloth dolls, were found untouched. In storage decades later, when the building was finally cleared, it was as if the children of Winthrop had no interest in play, no capacity for joy, and no curiosity about the world beyond their gates. The townsfolk of Ashford grew wary. At first they pitied the orphans, occasionally donating blankets or vegetables. But over the years the pity soured into fear. Farmers whispered of hearing the children outside at night, long after the gates were locked. One man swore he saw them walking in the fields at dawn, though when he returned with others, the children were already back in their places, standing at attention. Another claimed he passed by the orphanage and heard laughter echoing from the empty yard. Laughter that stopped abruptly the moment he turned his head. More disturbing still were the accounts of their faces. A traveling preacher, Reverend Doyle, wrote in his diary after visiting Ashford in 1905, "The children of Winthrop do not look upon you as children should. Their eyes are old. There is no innocence in them, no wonder. When I spoke the name of Christ, they did not flinch, did not bow, did not pray. They only stared, as if the word meant nothing. I tell you truly, there is no soul in those children, or if there is, it is not the soul of a child." By 1910, the strangeness was undeniable. Photographs of the group circulated, brought home by visitors or obtained by curious locals. And in those photographs, something extraordinary became apparent. The same children appeared again and again. A girl in a dark dress with a white collar, her hair tied in ribbons, staring blankly into the camera. A boy with a narrow face and neat bow tie, always standing in the same position at the edge of the row. Year after year, the images repeated themselves. The children did not age. Their features did not shift. The same girl in 1902 was the same girl in 1912, identical down to the ribbon in her hair. This was not a trick of memory. This was photographic evidence. And while skeptics argued that the children might be younger siblings or that, the photographs were mislabeled. The consistency was too exact to dismiss. Local families recognized the faces because they had seen them in person, standing in the orphanage yard. They swore that the children were the same across decades. One farmer's wife, Mrs. Lydia Cobb, told her granddaughter a story that has since been preserved in local lore. She claimed to have walked past the orphanage with her son in 1918 and pointed to the children, telling him, "They're the same ones I saw when I was your age." They haven't. The enigma deepened when outsiders attempted to remove children from the orphanage. Several adoption attempts were rumored, but none successful. Families who applied were told without explanation that no children were available. On one occasion, a wealthy couple from Louisville arrived with papers in hand, only to be turned away by the caretakers at the door. The couple insisted on seeing the children, and after a heated argument, were granted a brief glance into the main hall. What they saw left them shaken. The husband later wrote in a private letter to his brother they were standing there, perhaps 20 of them, dressed identically, staring at us without expression. It was not shyness nor discipline, but something far deeper. Their faces seemed wrong, too still, too symmetrical, as if they were masks rather than flesh. My wife began to weep, and I confess I felt an unease I cannot name. We fled the place at once, abandoning the adoption. I would sooner take a wolf into my home than one of those children, and so the orphanage remained sealed, its residents neither leaving nor entering, its numbers neither rising nor falling, suspended in a strange equilibrium. To the townsfolk, it became less an institution and more a shadow on the hill, a reminder of something unnatural nestled within their midst. Children dared each other to run up to the gates and touch them, but few ever did. Adults avoided the path entirely, choosing longer routes rather than passing the silent building. Yet the children endured, through wars, epidemics, and economic depression. The faces in the windows remained the same. And though they never cried out, never beckoned, never changed, their presence weighed heavily on all who saw them. It was as though Winthrop was not an orphanage at all, but a stage set, a tableau of children frozen in time, waiting for an audience that never came. Grown a day. Her son, confused, replied, "But Mama, that was 20 years ago." By the time the 1920s rolled in, the legend of the orphanage had spread beyond Ashford. Newspapers occasionally ran stories, framing it as curiosity or folklore. Skeptics dismissed the accounts as exaggeration. Believers whispered that the children were not children at all, but spirits, or worse, something inhuman wearing the shape of children. And yet, despite the theories, despite the fear, the building remained in operation. The children were always there, and they were always the Samif. The Winthrop orphanage had left nothing behind. Its story might have faded into nothing more than whispers of superstition, but it did leave something: photographs, black and white portraits, group shots taken by visitors or traveling photographers, survive in both private collections and dusty county archives. And what those photographs reveal is perhaps more unsettling than the silence of the records themselves. The earliest images, dated around 1902, show a familiar composition. Rows of children lined up before the brick facade of the orphanage. Their clothing is neat but plain, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable. At first glance, nothing unusual appears, but compare that image to another taken 10 years later, and a disturbing detail emerges. The faces are the same girl with ribboned hair, her gaze locked on the camera lens, the same boy with his narrow face and stiff bow tie, standing at the far right. The same girl with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, staring into the distance, not merely similar but identical. Down to the tilt of the head, the angle of the jaw, the vacant expression. Historians have pored over these images for decades. Were they mislabeled, staged? Were children simply dressed to resemble one another, creating the illusion of sameness? But the negatives confirm their authenticity. The plates, preserved in county storage, bear the correct dates. No evidence of tampering has ever been found. And the repetition stretches across decades, the same faces resurfacing. In 1912, 1918, 1925. One particularly haunting photograph, often circulated in books of American folklore, depicts a group of 23 children in the yard. Among them, near the center, is a girl in a black dress with a white collar. Locals call her the Winthrop girl. She appears in almost every surviving photo of the orphanage, always in the same position, always with the same hollow stare. The dress never changes. The collar never frays. In one image, a photographer noted the exposure was long, and yet, while others blurred slightly, her figure remained perfectly still. To the skeptical eye, perhaps she was simply a favored subject, dressed deliberately for each occasion. But to the residents of Ashford, she was proof of something unearthly. Families told stories of seeing her on the street in 1903 and 1913, in 1923, and never once did her appearance alter. She was ageless, one woman recalled. The same child I saw when I was younger than she looked, and when I was grown she was still the same. The photographs were not the only evidence. Ledgers from Winthrop survive, though in fragments. They list names: Sarah Thomas, Margaret James, but no birth records, no departure notes, no cause of death entries. It is as if the children were placed there and then remained indefinitely. Attempts to trace those names into adulthood fail at once. Census records list them only within the orphanage. Beyond its walls, they vanish. Researchers who have studied the case often point out how unusual this is. In other orphanages, even if records are incomplete, children can often be tracked, adopted into families, enlisted into the military, relocated to nearby towns. But for Winthrop's children, no such trail exists. They belong only to the orphanage, as if bound to it. In the 1970s, a local historian named Alan Brewer attempted to document the phenomenon. He gathered photographs, ledgers, and oral accounts, publishing a slim book titled The Children Who Never Grew. Brewer himself admitted he was not a believer in the supernatural, but the consistency of the testimony unnerved him. "There are too many repetitions," he wrote, "too many identical faces across too many decades. Either the greatest hoax in Kentucky history was perpetrated in the shadows of Ashford, or something deeply unnatural took root in that orphanage." Skeptics, of course, have their theories. Some suggest the photographs were staged by caretakers, perhaps reusing the same children for appearances while new orphans were kept hidden inside. Others argue the images were misdated or mislabeled, confusion compounded by poor record-keeping. But even these explanations falter when confronted with eyewitness accounts that span generations, all describing the same unchanged faces. One story, told by a woman named Margaret Lewis in the 1950s, is particularly chilling. She recalled as a child being brought to Ashford's Market by her mother, where the Winthrop children sometimes appeared. "I saw a girl with dark hair and ribbons," Lewis said. "She was standing still while the others walked. 20 years later, when I was grown, I visited Ashford again, and there she was, in the same dress, the same ribbons, not aged a day. I swear it on my life. It was as if the photograph had stepped out of its frame and onto the street." And so the photographs remain, undeniable, immutable. For believers, they are proof that the Winthrop orphanage housed something beyond explanation. For skeptics, they are an enigma too neat, too precise to be natural. But for everyone who has studied them, they are a reminder that some mysteries cannot be erased, only stared back at. Silent, unchanged, unyielding. The images invite a question that grows darker the longer one looks. Were these children truly alive at all? Or were the photographs capturing something else? A presence wearing the faces of children, forever frozen in time. If the photographs are to be believed, Winthrop was not merely an orphanage. It was a mirror into something outside of life itself. And the longer the children were observed, the clearer it became that they were not simply being cared for, they were being kept. Every orphanage has caretakers, men and women who serve as wardens, teachers, disciplinarians, protectors. But at Winthrop, the adults were far more elusive than the children they were charged with tending. The earliest records name only two: Elias Winthrop, the benefactor, whose fortune founded the home, and Miss Abigail Rowe, the matron. Elias was rarely seen, a reclusive figure who lived on the grounds but seldom appeared in public. Abigail, by contrast, became the face of the orphanage, a stern woman photographed at the head of nearly every group picture, standing ramrod straight with a fixed, watchful expression. But where other orphanages cycled through staff over the years, matrons, aging caretakers replaced, Winthrop's seemed to remain unchanged. Abigail Rowe appears in photographs spanning nearly 3 decades, her features unsoftened, her posture unbent. Even as decades passed, she showed no sign of the years catching up to her. Like the children under her care, she seemed untouched by time. Testimonies collected from locals describe her as both feared and respected. Some remembered her voice, sharp, cutting, precise. Others recalled her gaze, cold and unwavering, as if she were measuring the soul of whoever stood before her. But most telling are the accounts of her interactions with the children. Neighbors noted that she never spoke to them in public, never smiled or scolded, never offered a hand to guide or comfort. Instead, she hovered, watching, ensuring the children stayed in line, their movements oddly synchronized, their expressions vacant. Elias Winthrop remains even more of a mystery. Some claimed he had once been a physician, dabbling in experiments with life forces and vital energy. Others insisted he was merely a wealthy eccentric who wished to make a charitable mark on Kentucky. But rumors persisted that he rarely left his study, and that strange lights were seen glowing from its windows at odd hours. More than one account speaks of faint humming sounds drifting from the orphanage. At night, like machinery turning, or chanting carried on the wind. What is perhaps most unsettling is that neither Elias nor Abigail appear in any death records. No graves mark their passing. No obituary marks their departure. Like the children, they simply remain in the records as caretakers, until the orphanage closed, after which both names vanish completely from public record. Who were they really? Were they guardians, captors, or something far more sinister? Without them, Winthrop could not have existed. And yet, with them, the orphanage became something that defied every natural law. If the children were prisoners of time, then the caretakers were its wardens. But perhaps the darker truth is this: Elias Winthrop and Abigail Rowe were not preserving these children, they were preserving themselves. By the 1930s, whispers about Winthrop had grown too loud to ignore. Locals in Ashford avoided the orphanage grounds, claiming the children never aged, never played, never spoke above a whisper. Visitors reported the same children greeting them year after year, identical in appearance, manner, and silence. In 1933, state officials were dispatched to investigate. Their report, what little of it remains, is chilling. They noted the children were well kept, but disturbingly unresponsive, their answers rehearsed, their eyes unfocused. Inspectors described Abigail Rowe, still unchanged, still unbending, standing at the center of every room. Elias Winthrop, they wrote, was absent, though his quarters bore signs of recent habitation, papers scattered. Across his desk, vials of unmarked liquid and journals filled with diagrams that defied interpretation. Within months, the state ordered the orphanage shut down, and just like that, Winthrop ceased to exist. The children, all 24 of them, were reportedly relocated. Yet no adoption records survive, no transfers appear in state archives, and not a single child can be traced to any Kentucky household afterward. They disappeared, as if swallowed by the walls of the orphanage itself. As for the building, it was abandoned. Windows shattered. Vines overtook the brick. Locals said that even after its closure, the sound of children humming could be heard if you stood at its gates at dusk. And though fire later gutted much of the structure, its foundation remains, a scar in the hills of Ashford. The official story was simple: Winthrop failed due to mismanagement. But unofficially, no one doubted something far stranger had occurred. How could caretakers live decades without aging? How could children vanish without a trace? And what happened in the final days, when the orphanage was emptied, leaving only silence behind? Winthrop had closed its doors, but its mystery was far from buried. By the 1930s, whispers about Winthrop had grown too loud to ignore. Locals in Ashford avoided the orphanage grounds, claiming the children never aged, never played, never spoke above a whisper. Visitors reported the same children greeting them year after year, identical in appearance, manner, and silence. In 1933, state officials were dispatched to investigate. Their report, what little of it remains, is chilling. They noted the children were well kept, but disturbingly unresponsive, their answers rehearsed, their eyes unfocused. Inspectors described Abigail Rowe, still unchanged, still unbending, standing at the center of every room. Elias Winthrop, they wrote, was absent, though his quarters bore signs of recent habitation, papers scattered. Across his desk, vials of unmarked liquid and journals filled with diagrams that defied interpretation. Within months, the state ordered the orphanage shut down, and just like that, Winthrop ceased to exist. The children, all 24 of them, were reportedly relocated. Yet no adoption records survive, no transfers appear in state archives, and not a single child can be traced to any Kentucky household afterward. They disappeared, as if swallowed by the walls of the orphanage itself. As for the building, it was abandoned. Windows shattered, vines overtook the brick. Locals said that even after its closure, the sound of children humming could be heard if you stood at its gates at dusk. And though fire later gutted much of the structure, its foundation remains, a scar in the hills of Ashford. The official story was simple: Winthrop failed due to mismanagement. But unofficially, no one doubted something far stranger had occurred. How could caretakers live decades without aging? How could children vanish without a trace? And what happened in the final days, when the orphanage was emptied, leaving only silence behind? Winthrop had closed its doors, but its mystery was far from buried. Some say the children are still out there. Some say they never existed. The truth lies, as always, behind the walls of history. And if you dare to look closer, you may just find it. This has been Behind the Genius. The Winthrop Orphanage leaves us with questions we may never answer. Were these children prisoners of time, or something far stranger? Did Elias Winthrop discover a secret science, or unleash a curse that could never be undone? What we know for certain is that their story has outlived the orphanage itself, echoing across generations, refusing to be silenced. Some mysteries die with time. This one refuses to. If you found this story as haunting as we did, don't let it disappear into the shadows. Subscribe to Behind the Genius and turn on notifications, so you'll be the first to uncover the hidden stories history tried to erase. Share this episode with a friend who thinks they've seen every ghost story, and let us know in the comments. Do you think the children of Winthrop ever truly existed, or were they something else entirely? Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never forget to look deeper behind the genius.